Hello, welcome to episode 2 of Words Like That. I'm Cole Powell. If you didn't catch the first episode, be sure to go check that out. I went over this a little bit in that first episode, what this podcast is. We've billed it as Arts, Media, and Beyond, a storyteller podcast, which basically just means I'm going to be talking about a lot of arts and entertainment, which is the realm I work in and I have a lot of knowledge of and passion for. And I'll be mixing in some other topics of interest within that. Our first episode was on music, and this one is all about film. I love film. I originally intended to go to film school to become a writer-director. I ultimately chose a different path, but I was still able to study film academically in my liberal arts and sciences program, and I just can't get enough of cinema. And today I'll be giving a rundown on 3 of the summer's biggest blockbusters that I've seen in theaters, plus The Dark Knight turns 15, and a cult animated Disney series might finally be hitting the big screen with an A-list director. Story number 1, Sound of Freedom stuns Hollywood. A little bit of background on this film. It's the true story of an ex-DHS agent, Tim Ballard, who essentially went rogue in the best possible way, quit his job with the government to go rescue children from unimaginably horrible situations, to put it delicately. It's try to keep this a clean, family-oriented podcast. I'm not going to go into details here. The film was shot in 2018. It was scheduled for a 2019 release to be distributed by a Latin American 20th Century Fox subsidiary. Disney bought Fox, and here the stories between Disney and the film's producers seem to diverge. The producers say that Disney shelved the film, which to me implies a willful act. Disney says they weren't even aware they own the film because it would have been filed under foreign acquisitions. And I don't know enough about the workings of these types of deals to comment on the veracity of that story, whether it's plausible or not. But regardless, the producers were eventually able to buy the rights back from Disney. So at some point, Disney had to have become aware that they own the film in order to sell it. The movie got picked up by Angel Studios, which is an independent studio best known for the New Testament series adaptation, The Chosen, which was another surprise hit. Some episodes have been released theatrically. They've made millions. I've watched a few episodes from season 1. It's got a high production value. It's a little what I would call fillerific for me, a lot of filler. But I'm sure I'll finish it. It's definitely one of the best biblical adaptations since biblical adaptations quit being a standard subgenre 60 years ago. So anyway, Angel Studios schedules Sound of Freedom for Tuesday, July 4th, domestic-only limited release. And that's an odd release date. But I get it. They didn't want to compete with Indiana Jones, which came out the previous Friday. They want to tie into the freedom theme with the 4th of July holiday. And it was only playing in 2,850 theaters, which is nothing compared to what Indiana Jones was playing in. And it was projected to make between 11 and 15 million its opening week. Opening week, okay, not opening day, but opening week. Which, that would have been outstanding, considering the circumstances. But realistically, it's not going to make a lot of money, right? Okay. Not only does it nearly recoup its $14.5 million budget on day 1, the 4th of July, on a Tuesday, it outgrosses Indiana Jones domestically on that day, which is just astounding. And it's also ironic that Disney sold the film off and it came back to beat Disney's own blockbuster on that day. Now, Some critics have noted that about 2 million of that gross on that one day came from Angel Studios' Pay It Forward program. This is a kind of post-production crowdfunding program in which fans can buy tickets for others to claim for free, and Angel Studios uses for The Chosen. It's been a big moneymaker for them, and I don't really understand how they've gotten it to work, but it has. So the argument can be made that at least some part of that $2 million went in unclaimed tickets that were just sitting out there, people had paid for, but nobody actually bought them, went to the show. Even still, if you subtract that $2 million, you're still looking at $12 million plus on day one. Okay, 4th of July, Tuesday, against an Indiana Jones film. Any way you slice it, really, really incredible feat. It went on to gross $40 million in its first week, came in third at the box office behind Indiana Jones and Insidious, which were two franchise films with a pre-existing fan base. The next week, it expanded to 3,265 theaters. It came in second behind Mission Impossible in that film's first weekend, in Mission Impossible's first weekend. The next week, it came in third behind Barbie and Oppenheimer, which is the biggest movie event in years, certainly this year. Since then, it's continued to be added to more theaters, expanded into more screens. Theaters that had originally agreed to carry it for a couple of days have still been playing it a month out, or they've brought it back with more screenings. The theater that's closest to me, which is a 30-minute drive, only had it originally for a couple of days, for a couple of screenings in that first week. And I had to drive an extra 15 minutes to another city in the opposite direction to go see it that first week. Well, as of last week, that first theater had gotten the film back and was showing it on 3 screenings a day. So that's pretty incredible. That's not something that usually happens. At the time that we're shooting this on August 11th. I hope to have the audio version of this out pretty quickly. Not sure when the video version will hit YouTube. But as of August 11th, according to Box Office Mojo, it has grossed $167 million. And that's just domestically because it has not had an international release. $167 million. That's over 10 times its budget. After it hit $150 million, that was on August 1st, that was 10 days from when we're filming this, CNBC ran an article. At that time, it had grossed $150 million. Mission Impossible had only made $140 domestically. The Flash, which came out earlier this year, had just over $100 million domestically. So it had beat Mission Impossible and The Flash in gross domestic box office, which is just, that's absolutely unheard of. It's now being released internationally. Deadline confirmed this. It'll have South African release on August 18th, Australia and New Zealand on the 24th, Central and South America on the 31st, UK and Ireland September 1st, and Spain on October 11th. So it's just going to keep making more and more money. Again, this is on a $15 million budget. Okay, actually slightly less than $15 million. Now, how was the film? And we're going to get into spoiler territory here. Not much, but a little bit. If you want to go in completely blind, then you may want to skip this. It was a tough watch, considering the subject matter, and I'm not going to get into it on air again, but particularly the first third of the movie was really difficult to get through, particularly as a father, particularly knowing that the majority of the film is a true story. And nothing is shown, nothing is graphic, but you know what's supposed to be taking place off camera, and it just makes for a really, really uncomfortable watch. By the time it gets to the third act, it's much easier to watch because it's more of a focused thriller with Ballard, the lead character, going in to extract a girl he's been trying to rescue since the beginning. He goes into a jungle in South America to get her away from some gorillas. And that's where the near total fabrication point of the movie starts. And even though that's much more fabricated than the rest of the film, it makes for a much more compelling, more cinematic final act. In terms of the technical aspects, it's a really well-made film. It's being billed as a faith-based film because the real Tim Ballard is Mormon, as it is his character in the film, although they never say he's a Mormon, and they play it kind of as generic Christian. And you got Jim Caviezel plays Tim. Jim is a Catholic in real life. He played Jesus in Passion of the Christ. But this is not a faith-based film. And I don't really like that term, because if you look back in movie history, from the silent era to the 1960s, there were plenty of films that were either based on Bible stories or featured people who were religious, Bing Crosby as a priest or what have you. And none of these movies were billed as faith-based. They were just historical dramas or musical or whatever. And then Hollywood quit making those types of films. And when religious people started trying to make their own indie movies with religious elements, they were dubbed faith-based. Then faith-based became synonymous with low budget or low brow. So now anytime any film with a religious theme comes out, it's labeled as faith-based and immediately presumed to be subpar in terms of its filmmaking quality, in terms of the technical aspects. It's not faith-based, and it's also not terrible. The directing and cinematography are great. Caviezel, who I love, his Count of Monte Cristo is one of my favorite films of all time. He is fantastic in this film. Most of the immediate supporting players are also really good. The two lead children and their father will break your heart, just absolutely gut-wrenching. When you get into some of the peripheral circle of characters, the acting is not as good. It's more what you would have expected from a lower budget indie effort than the rest of the movie is. And there's also a couple of spots that were a little more lowbrow again on the shot composition and some of the editing choices. But overall, it's solid on every level, and it's covering an important underexposed topic. On the family angle, I'm a father. Whenever I watch and review films, I try to be mindful of age appropriateness. This one is not for the kids. It's PG-13, and I would only take a 13-year-old if they're mentally and emotionally strong and mature, and you've had a long, hard talk with them about some harsh realities of the world. My oldest daughter is 10. I definitely would not be taking her to see this film for a few more years. My objective rating on analyzing all the technical aspects of the film, the acting, directing, cinematography, all those things I mentioned previously, I would give this an 8 out of 10. My subjective rating, based sheerly on how much I enjoyed the film personally, how much personal enjoyment I derived, I'd have to give it a 6 out of 10. And that's not because it's not good, as we just established that it was a really good film, but it's hard to derive enjoyment out of the subject matter at hand. And if the last act hadn't been a little less harsh and more Hollywood action hero goes into the jungle to rescue the kid, I might have given it a 5 out of 10 for personal enjoyment. But still, it's an important film, and I recommend catching it in theaters if you get the chance. Story number 2. Tom Cruise is the last movie star. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1. I love the Mission Impossible films. 2 is the weakest for me. 3 is the best. I would put Dead Reckoning definitely an upper tier Mission Impossible film. We'll take the bad first. There are moments that are just preposterous, impossible, pardon the pun. You're required to suspend your disbelief because it's just so far-fetched and out there, which is just like all the rest of the films. And there are a few plot holes and one really glaring plot hole going into the climax. And this is a spoiler alert, so if you don't want spoiler, you may want to skip ahead. But they make a big deal about Tom Cruise boarding a moving train. Yet there's a villain who boards the train with no problem. And there's no explanation why Tom couldn't have boarded at some point. And they could have explained it. They could have easily had some line of dialogue or just a visual that makes you understand, why he can't board it at that spot where the villain did. But they don't. So it becomes a plot hole. And it was a little annoying for me personally. The movie's too long. It's 2 hours and 45 minutes. And I like sitting through long movies just as much as the next guy, or probably more so the next guy. I grew up watching a lot of the long classic epics, Gone with the Wind, Lawrence of Arabia, that kind of thing. But 2 hours and 45-minute runtime. It's got a 20-minute prologue, and that's 20 minutes before the credits roll. And I have not seen a prologue this long, probably since Batman Begins, which is one of the lengthiest prologues I've ever seen. And I'm not sure where they could have cut in that first 20 minutes, but there's no doubt, if I went back and looked and really analyzed it, there's no doubt they could have just snipped some here and kind of slimmed that down maybe to a good 15 minutes. And the prologue's composed of essentially 4 segments, and then the rest of the movie, which is going to be over 2 hours, is really 6 broad segments. There's a car chase, which is obligatory in Mission Impossible movies, action films in general. And I've been burnt out on car chases for about 20 years, but they did a good job making it fresh and interesting and different and unique. But after about 12 minutes, it really started to get old. And they could have cut the whole thing down to 15 minutes max, really probably 12 minutes, just the entire thing. 12 minutes would have been a lot better. Also, another spoiler here, the human villain is somebody key from Ethan's past, Ethan Hunt, Tom Cruise's character. But we've never seen this guy before. And it's hard to connect and feel the impact we're supposed to feel. And they brought back all these characters from the previous films. You got Luther, Benji, Ilsa, the White Widow, Kittredge, who we haven't seen since Mission Impossible 1, and all of them are great. All of that's great. But if they could have figured out how to bring in a villain we've seen before, I think it would have been a lot better. I think we would have cared a lot more about his and Tom's relationship and their history, but at this point we just don't, so we don't get the impact I think we're supposed to get from that. Also, another spoiler here, it doesn't end on that big of a cliffhanger. I understood that this is supposed to be a conclusion to the franchise, part 1, part 2, but Tom Cruise recently said he hopes to be the next Harrison Ford, where he's making Mission Impossibles when he's 80, and talked about Harrison Ford going and making all this stuff, Blade Runner and Indiana Jones and stuff. And he could have just been a joke or a semi-joke, but if these are the final films, everything's pretty much resolved in this first movie except the main general threat, but all the rest of the plot threads are really wrapped up. And I was expecting kind of a Fellowship of the Ring cliffhanger, like it didn't really leave me ready for that next movie immediately like I was expecting it to, and like I felt like it should if these are indeed the final 2 films of the series. Now that I've said all that, none of it matters at all. This is high-octane popcorn summer cinema at its finest. It's satisfying for Mission Impossible fans and general audiences, and that's because Tom Cruise is the last movie star. He's the last actor interested in making mass-appealing crowd pleasers. He did it last year with Top Gun Maverick, which single-handedly saved the 2022 box office. And you can make the argument that it saved the post-pandemic box office because we had not really had a hit outside of maybe Spider-Man No Way Home up until that time since the pandemic. And he just keeps doing it over and over again with these Mission Impossible films. Dead Reckoning is a classic story of good and evil. And for a political thriller, it's apolitical. And spoiler alert again here, the primary threat is an AI, which is incredibly relevant. And it's also funny because it was written several years before we got in this current AI mania. And I talked a little bit about the AI mania going on in the last episode. So if you haven't checked that out, go check that out. But all decent people can agree that an evil AI is bad and that corrupt governments out to wield an evil AI or any kind of AI to manipulate and control the masses is bad. Like, all that is a bad thing. And the most political line in the movie is something about the AI is disseminating misinformation on social media. And what I felt was brilliant about this line, everybody in today's polarized political climate considers anything the opposing side says as misinformation. So everybody snickers at that line regardless of what side of the political aisle they're on. So it's an easy way to inject politics without being divisive, which some might have a problem with. Maybe they want some divisiveness, or maybe they want a line that specifically speaks to their own political inclinations. I don't, in general, and I don't think most moviegoers do. We get enough of that in real life, and I think that we just need a little bit of an escape, and that's what the Mission Impossible movies provide. On the family angle, as a father, I don't have a problem with violence. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of violence in there. That's not something that I would have a problem with my kids watching. It's not nothing gory, nothing too bloody, just general sci-fi action type violence. I am more concerned about language, innuendo, adult situations. So I went to see it, and I thought it was clean enough for my 10-year-old to go see it. I went back with her. The language was a bit more than I realized when I watched it the first time. The second watch, probably because my daughter was actually there, I picked up on some more language that didn't really stick out to me the first time. So if it might be a bit much if you really have a problem with adult language. And there's one scene with wide and background club shots, and you can't really tell whether there are people, are they naked, are they scantily clad, are they just wearing skin tight clothes? You don't really know what you're looking at, but that's just it. You don't know. So I thought it was fine because you don't know what you're looking at. Couldn't tell at all. It just something looked a little weird. So I took my 10-year-old. She loved it. And you might want to check out some more comprehensive parental ratings before you take your kids. But for me, it was fine for my 10-year-old. My objective rating, from analyzing all the different technical parts of the movie, I would give this an 8 out of 10. My subjective rating, based sheerly on my personal enjoyment, I would give this a 10 out of 10. I absolutely loved it. If you like the Mission Impossible films, go see this movie. It's a satisfying ride. You got classic storytelling with just enough subversion of expectations to keep it interesting and humorous. And you'll leave the theater having seen a well-made, entertaining film, and it's just the kind of film that I think most people want to see, and it's the kind of film Tom Cruise wants to make, and he continues to make, and that is why he is the last movie star. Story number 3, Oppenheimer. So let's recap Christopher Nolan's career here. Memento, which is one of the greatest films of all time, in my opinion. Insomnia, great remake of a small psychological thriller. The Dark Knight trilogy, greatest comic book superhero trilogy ever made. The Dark Knight is still the greatest comic book movie of all time, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. The Prestige is my personal favorite film of all time. Inception, Best Picture nominee, one of the greatest science fiction films of all time. Interstellar, I feel, was his only major misstep. The first act of that was a slog. The second act was solid. Then you got the third act turned into Christopher Nolan's version of the ending of 2001: A Space Odyssey. But the ending of 2001: A Space Odyssey is very abstract, and I think Nolan is too logical to make that type of ending really stick. Then you got Dunkirk, which was a riveting war film. Tenet, which I know a lot of people hated. I thought it was incredibly inventive time travel story. I really enjoyed it. So, short version is I love Christopher Nolan, okay? Absolutely love the guy. All that said, and I appear to be in a slim minority on what I'm about to say. So if you're watching and listening to this on a platform that allows comments and you want to express your disagreement, I get it. Just please keep it civil. The first description that came to mind while I was watching this movie, Oppenheimer, was pretentious slog. And I think that may be a little unfair. It's definitely a slog, but I don't think Christopher Nolan is actually being pretentious, but it certainly comes off that way. Either way, I thought this film was a giant misstep for him. At least his second worst film behind Interstellar and possibly his number one worst film. So let's start with the good. We did Mission Impossible, start with the bad first. Let's start with the good on this one. The performances are stellar. Some of the best acting I've seen in a film, period. Cillian Murphy will win Best Actor at the Oscars this year. The cinematography is incredible. Hoyt van Hoytema, if that's how you pronounce his name, will win Best Cinematography. And that's it. That's the good. Everything else about the movie I thought was abysmal. It's a narrative mess, and I love nonlinear storytelling. It requires an extra level of intellectual engagement to follow, and I like that mental challenge. And most of Nolan's films employ some kind of nonlinear element. The two best examples are probably Memento and The Prestige. Memento uses black and white for the past story that's moving forward, and then color for the future portion that's moving backward, which is really creative. Is what makes it one of the greatest movies of all time, in my opinion. The Prestige has 3 timelines intercut, and Oppenheimer combines those 2 types of nonlinear storytelling devices with the black and white color hybrid, but also it's multiple intercut timelines. At first, it appears that the farthest future sequences are in black and white, and all the past stuff at a certain point are in color. But then there are sequences that start to pop up that are depicted before some of the color sequences, and they're also in black and white. So it starts to look like that Nolan is just being artsy for art's sake. And it isn't until the big twist, big reveal toward the end of the final act, which I'm going to get to in a minute, that I realized the pattern to the color switch. And for me, it's eye-rolling. And I'll explain when we get to the characters, but as for all the other time jumping, maybe there's a pattern, but the story is so drawn out and the lead characters are so unlikable, I had no interest in making the effort to unravel it. Let's talk about the characters here. So this is obviously a biopic. It's history. It's based on a specific biography of Oppenheimer, 2005 book called American Prometheus, written by Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin. And from what I've read, the movie is fairly accurate to the true story. So Oppenheimer obviously was not the greatest guy. He's arrogant. He's an unrepentant womanizer, unrepentant philanderer. And the film doesn't shy away from that, and that's great. I get it, and that's fine. For a biography book to be that detailed as the movie is, and had I read the biography, I probably would have walked away thinking, wow, fascinating guy, interesting read. But for me, with film, it's different and should be different. I think about biopics like Walk the Line or Ray that didn't gloss over their subject's warts, but they also showed us some good in these people and in their lives that had us wanting them to triumph at the end. What does Oppenheimer give us to make us care about this guy, to sympathize with him? He feels guilty about having created something that killed so many people. Okay, sure, that's terrible. I would never want to be in his position, but I don't care. Based on what I saw in the movie, I don't care that he feels guilty. He is a terrible person. In one of the story threads, there's this ongoing hearing over Oppenheimer's security clearance, and it's 1954, and they're going to revoke his security clearance. Are we supposed to feel sorry about that? Because I don't. The movie establishes the guy was at best an admitted communist sympathizer, and he only semi-disavowed his political leanings to get the atomic bomb gig, so you could kind of say he was kind of spineless and really had no conviction. Then he continued to associate with the communists and turned out one of the guys that he hosted at the base while building the bomb was a Soviet spy. There's a scene where a communist friend tried to let Oppenheimer know if he had some info that he wanted to get to Russia, he could help, kind of be a go-between, which, of course, would have been treason if Oppenheimer had done that. And then Oppenheimer admitted that he lied to one of the investigating security officers about that incident. So the guy was a clear security risk, regardless of where your politics are or what Oppenheimer's politics were. Based on what we saw in the film, he was a legitimate security risk and had been the entire time. And the only reason that the U.S. used him to build the bomb was it was war and they didn't really have any other options. They were desperate. So it was like, okay, sure, he's a security risk, but he's all we got. Okay. So I don't care that he's going through this hearing and might get his security clearance revoked. And we already know, basically based on the farthest future scenes, that he got his clearance revoked. Same with Emily Blunt's character. Emily Blunt plays Oppenheimer's wife, whose name I can't remember, and I didn't bother to look it up because I just don't care. She's cheating on her husband with Oppenheimer, like the first time they meet. Her husband, I think Oppenheimer was like her third husband. This was her second husband. She's cheating on her second husband with Oppenheimer. And the first time they meet, it's like, oh yeah, we're fixing to have an affair. Immediately, she gets pregnant with Oppenheimer's baby, divorces the husband, marries Oppenheimer. She's a raging alcoholic. There is no indication she made any real effort to break that habit, to better herself. She's still drinking like 20 years into the future that we see. She actively, publicly hates her children, hates being a mother. There's a scene when Oppenheimer comes home. She's roaring drunk. Their kid's crying. And there's no telling how long the kid has been like that in their ball inside. And this is a baby, okay? That's child neglect. If that were to happen today, CPS would come in, okay? And she's mad about Oppenheimer's continued affair with this girl he was seeing before he met the wife. And she's still mad 10, 15 years later. But from an audience perspective, it's like, you did the same thing with Oppenheimer with no qualms whatsoever and show no remorse whatsoever. So it's kind of hard. I feel sorry for you in this situation. And there's a scene in one of the future sections at the hearing over the security clearance. It's being revoked. This is in 1954. And the wife, Emily Blunt's character, is testifying about her former membership in the Communist Party. And she starts off timid. And this is a bit of a spoiler here. Sorry, I should have said that a little bit earlier. But she starts off timid and then ends up turning a bunch of gotcha questions that this lawyer is asking against the lawyer. And you can tell we're supposed to be enthralled by that scene, by her responses. And standing up and cheering like, oh yeah, she got him, look at that go. But I could not have cared less about that scene. The character hadn't done anything in the entire film to earn that moment. Then you got Florence Pugh, and I love Florence Pugh. I think she's one of the best actresses working out there today. But her character is just awful. She's psychologically disturbed. She's oscillating on Cillian Murphy. I want you. I don't want you. I need you. I don't need you. And big spoiler here, eventually she commits suicide after Oppenheimer tells her that their relationship is over. And this happened in real life. And it's sad and it's tragic that it happened. But based on what we see on the screen, I don't feel any sadness for her as a character. And I'm not sad for him for having gone through that and having lost her. I just, again, I don't care. And I feel bad that I don't care about this horrible thing that happened. But for me, the filmmakers have done nothing to make me care and feel sympathy for any of these characters. And the way their physical relationship, the Florence Pugh and Cillian Murphy character was handled, is shocking for a Nolan film. Nolan is known for handling love scenes delicately. It's like an old school sensibility. He doesn't show anything graphic. And another spoiler here, you get Florence Pugh and Cillian Murphy's characters. They meet, boom, cut, they're in bed. You get some nudity. Then there's an awkward scene later where they're sitting across from each other, totally nude. You don't see certain things, but still really weird. They're just sitting in chairs talking to each other. This is whenever he breaks up with her. I thought it was really weird. Then there's an even weirder scene in which Emily Blunt and maybe Cillian Murphy, maybe Oppenheimer's character, I'm not really sure 100% what we're supposed to get from that, but definitely Emily Blunt's character is envisioning Florence Pugh and Cillian Murphy in front of her and the rest of the people at the hearing. This is a scene in the hearing in that section of the timeline. And Emily Blunt is envisioning them together. And I get it. It was supposed to be a visual representation of what it felt like having Oppenheimer's affair discussed in public like that. It's just all wide open and everybody can envision it. I get it, but it's just really weird, really uncomfortable. Then there's Robert Downey Jr. I love Robert Downey Jr. from Chaplin to Tony Stark, and everybody's saying he's totally unrecognizable in this role. He literally looks like himself. And I already mentioned the stellar performances of the cast. And I never thought I'd say this, but one exception in that is Robert Downey Jr. For me, that role could have been played just as well by 150 other actors. And there's nothing special about the character that lends itself to being a standout performance. That being said, for most of the picture, Robert Downey Jr.'s character, Strauss, seems to be the only character worth rooting for. I thought, oh, he's going to end up being the hero. The character is nuanced, but he's ultimately a good guy. And spoiler alert, in that shocking twist I mentioned, that's near the end of the movie, it's revealed, oh no, Robert Downey Jr. is the villain. And Oppenheimer is the good guy the whole time. Oppenheimer really is the good guy. And it's not just that Robert Downey Jr. is the villain. In order for his character to have behaved like we've seen him behave, and then to have secretly orchestrated this coup against Oppenheimer that he supposedly orchestrated, he would have had to have been a total sociopath, completely irredeemable. And that's what his character is reduced to after this twist. He's just, at this point, he becomes a one-dimensional, sneering, malicious villain. Just basically a caricature that we've seen over and over in films, how many times at this point? And it's here where we realize, or maybe not realize, but it's where I realize that all of the black and white scenes were from Robert Downey Jr.'s perspective. You know, 'cause he's the villain, and he only sees the world in black and white. And Cillian Murphy's character, Oppenheimer's character, all the scenes that were in color were from Oppenheimer's perspective, 'cause, you know, he's the hero, and he sees the world in color. And I just thought that was so lame. It did not work for me at all. So now we have nobody to root for in the picture. And I don't care that Oppenheimer feels guilty. I don't care if he lost his security clearance. I don't care that his wife got cheated on, had to go through the hearing ordeal. And it's sad that this happened in real life, as I said earlier, but watching this as a film, again, I don't care about Pugh's character dying or what that did to Oppenheimer. And obviously, since Robert Downey Jr. turns out to be the villain of the piece, I also don't care about him. When you're telling a story as a piece of art entertainment in a modern sense, previously in the 19th century, you read books like Moby Dick. Moby Dick's one of my favorite books, but Moby Dick has some chapters in there that really aren't necessary for the story. They're good and they're fun, they're cool, but they're not necessary for the story. Well, one of the reasons that was okay then, literature was the primary form of entertainment. And the longer the book is, the more it had in there, the longer you had that entertainment, the longer you had that escape. It's not necessary now for modern storytelling unless you're just trying to recapture that old feel. So you need more than just the facts. It's like the Dragnet Jack Webb line, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. That's what this feels like. It feels like that it's a textbook or a historical account for posterity, but scrambled up. And it needs focus. Any kind of storytelling in the modern sense, it needs some kind of focus. Even this review, when I was making notes for this episode, there were a lot of other thoughts I had that I could have put in here, but I was trying to get the opinions and observations I thought were most relevant and then bring them together in some type of sensible conclusion. And ordinarily, Christopher Nolan is a master at this. And if you're trying to tell a story like Oppenheimer, you have to have somebody to relate to or somebody to root for, and a primary point, and not just history with all its minutia on the screen. And Nolan's usually good at that too. But he completely misses the mark here for me. And it feels like I'm watching the film version of the first draft of a PhD in history candidate's doctoral thesis after he dropped it on the ground and all the pages got mixed up. And Christopher Nolan comes along and picks it up, this scrambled first draft of a doctoral thesis, and says, okay, here's our shooting script. That's what this felt like. The vision is too broad. The narrative is dull. The conclusions are empty. All we get here is Oppenheimer lived, and he did these things. He felt this way. That's what happened. The end. We're supposed to be interested in the story, but are given nothing to engage us. We're supposed to feel sympathy for the hero, but we're given no reason to care about him. So the family angle of this is definitely not for kids. It's rated R. There's a lot of language. I talked about the adult situations, nudity earlier. The kids probably aren't going to want to see this anyway or care about anything that happens in this 3 hours. My objective rating would be a 6 out of 10, and that's solely based on the strength of the performances and cinematography because they're that good. My subjective rating, which is just personal enjoyment level, I'd give this a 2 out of 10. I did not care for this film basically at all. I don't recommend it, but everybody else seems to love the movie, so I can't say that you won't enjoy it if you go see it. Now, speaking of Christopher Nolan films, story number 4, The Dark Knight turns 15. This was July 17th, 2008. I went to the Thursday night special 8 o'clock premiere showing of The Dark Knight at my local theater. And when I got home, I wrote a quick note of my thoughts on a little refrigerator magnet marker board. And this is what I wrote. I wrote Best Picture, Best Director, Best Supporting Actor, Best Cinematography, Best Adapted Screenplay, and I think one or two other Oscar categories I thought it should be nominated for and win. And at the very bottom, I wrote Best Comic Book Superhero Movie of All Time. Now, obviously, it was never going to be nominated for any of that, except maybe the supporting actor category for Heath Ledger, but I'm not even sure if it would have got that nomination had it not been for Heath tragically passing. It should have, but I'm not sure if it would have had not been for that element. But I rewatched The Dark Knight for its 15th anniversary, and I stand by my initial assessment that I wrote at the bottom of that marker board 15 years ago. It is the GOAT. At the time I wrote that, though, I expected the genre was going to get better from there. But 15 years later, even after we've had dozens of Marvel Universe offerings, and don't get me wrong, I love a lot of those movies. We've had a few great Fox X-Men flicks, an entire shared DC universe. Even after all that, The Dark Knight is still the best. And we can get into all the individual components, the acting, directing, writing, but all the really good superhero movies have those elements to them, have really good acting and writing and directing. So what sets The Dark Knight apart from all the rest of these movies? What makes it the greatest? First, it takes itself seriously. It asks the question, if Batman existed in the real world, why would he exist? Okay, so that's number one. How would he act? And how would the world react? How would his world react to him? These are the same questions that Nolan asked in Batman Begins. He just expanded on them in this movie. And with that expansion, we got deeper questions of justice and vigilantism. We got the question of, when the legal authority fails to uphold justice, is it right for a citizen to mete out that justice on his own? We get into systemic institutional corruption. How far can a person morally go to fight the corruption before becoming a villain? We've got the classic good versus evil theme, but instead of some sneering, mustache-twirling villain or some unrelatable cosmic or global threat, we have a realistic embodiment of that evil in this genius, sociopathic, anarchic terrorist played to absolute perfection by Heath Ledger. You could see this Joker in real life. You could see somebody that crazy, that depraved in real life doing stuff like this. So maybe it's the best superhero movie because, in a way, it's not really a superhero movie at all. It's a thought-provoking crime drama that just so happens to feature a character wearing a cape and beating up the bad guys. Unfortunately, the comic book movie machines that developed in the post-Dark Knight landscape learned all the wrong lessons from the movie. You got Marvel, and again, I've loved most of their films, but Marvel set out to differentiate itself with bright colors and copious one-liners and impossible plot devices and this bombast and all this flash. And there's room for that, and it worked a lot. but it was it was a reaction to The Dark Knight. Yet, arguably, their best movie, The Winter Soldier, is more grounded and topical and is their most Dark Knight-esque picture. And that's one of the reasons why it's their best, possibly their absolute best. And then you got DC, on the other hand, which Batman is a DC property. Double down on the grit and philosophy, which worked great in The Dark Knight, to the point of producing these dull, brooding, pretentious pseudo-epics. And The Dark Knight, it avoids the flash and the bombast and the spectacle for grounded, gritty realism and larger philosophical themes, but without ever becoming grim or humorless and never failing to entertain. No other comic book movie film before had quite brought all those ingredients together with that level of masterful execution, and none have since. And I'm not sure one ever will. You look at all the genres, a genre has to peak at some time. And you look at the genres that have gone before, the comic book superhero movies. Has there been a better Western made since The Searchers? Maybe you could argue for some, but definitely not in the last 30 years. You look at gangster pictures. Has a better gangster picture been made than The Godfather? Maybe The Godfather Part 2. What other film are you going to argue there? Maybe Goodfellas. Even so, you're back to that 30 plus years again. I feel like those genres peaked. So will a new superhero comic book movie ever top The Dark Knight? Maybe. I don't know. But unless until that day comes, for what it's worth, The Dark Knight remains the greatest comic book superhero film of all time. All right. Final story. Story number 5 is Gargoyles finally hitting the big screen. Now, this is one of my favorite series of all time. Gargoyles is a cult 90s animated series from Disney. If we take out cultural, historical significance from the criteria and judge solely on writing, animation, originality, voice acting, this is probably the best action cartoon of the 90s, maybe of all time. It just didn't become part of the zeitgeist like Batman, X-Men, Spider-Man. And had it been on Fox Kids Saturday morning instead of weekday morning first run syndication, I think it might have gotten to that level, but it just didn't. And they've been talking about making a movie out of Gargoyles since the late 90s. And the last time was a few years ago. Jordan Peele actually pitched an adaptation to Disney, but Disney passed. And it's probably a good thing from my perspective as a fan of the original series. I think Jordan would probably have wanted to do his own thing, and it just needs to be the series on screen. I think it's ready-made for cinema. Even a cinematic universe could come out of this thing. The show had everything. It had fantasy, mythology, sci-fi, action, intrigue, thematic depth, compelling characters. And the pilot episode was actually a 5-parter, so it was already movie length. So really they just need to make another pass at that pilot script, and they've got their first movie ready to go. And it had its own in-universe version of Macbeth that would make an incredible second film. I thought it was just phenomenal. And the whole series actually drew a lot from Shakespeare. There's a lot of references, even Shakespearean characters like Macbeth. They had Puck in there, which is why this news is so exciting for me, having seen the series and knowing all the Shakespearean undertones and being a fan of Shakespeare in addition to Gargoyles. And really, Gargoyles is my introduction to Shakespeare, and I think that's true for a lot of people that watch the series. But probably the most well-known Shakespearean actor-director alive has reportedly signed on to direct the first live-action adaptation. So this is from a publication called Giant Freaking Robot, and they're often derided for posting rumors, but they've also broken a lot of big stories that turned out to be true. So this could go either way. But Giant Freaking Robot is reporting that Kenneth Branagh will be helming a Gargoyles film, which for me is just perfect because of his pedigree and the Shakespeare aspect to the show. But the Gargoyles creator, Greg Wiseman, he tweeted that he doesn't believe that this is true. He thinks this is just a rumor. But Disney hasn't always kept Greg Wiseman in the loop, so he doesn't really know. So who knows? We'll see. But if this is true, as a fan, on paper, this just seems perfect. Branagh comes from a Shakespearean background, like I said. He's also got a lot of credentials and credibility in the speculative fiction realm. He directed Thor, which I thought was really good, really underrated MCU entry. He played Gilderoy Lockhart in Harry Potter. So if this is true, as long as they stick close to the source material, there's no reason this shouldn't be a phenomenal film. And it could be a huge new franchise for Disney if they do it right. But if they stray too far from that original narrative, from what made it great, from what made it a cult classic, what the fans love about it, it could be another disaster, which Disney does not need. Okay, that's going to wrap us up. Hope you enjoyed this movie-centric episode. We hope to release at least one new episode a month, so subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we will see you soon.
Can't handle words like that. Well,